Good afternoon, gentle readers, fellow earthlings. It's October 21st, 2024, Monday. And so today is another episode of Moment in Motion, the physics of mechanics, the mathematical model of moment in motion. And as with regards to that, it's in part something that's very well explored classically and very, of course, completely defined, and it is, and it's very well understood and applied, very widely applied, and it's great. And that as well, there's at least one feature of mechanics which is underdefined. Here is what's framed as 0 seconds per meter is infinity meters per second. Or rather, usually here it's vice versa. 0 meters per second is infinity seconds per meter. There's no motion, see, so it's time is enduring as so far as that goes. So what that then gets into is that for any change in motion is that there's a first derivative with respect to displacement, with respect to time, or first derivative of displacement with respect to time, and a second and third and so following, the higher orders of acceleration. And there's no highest order of acceleration. There are infinitely many higher orders of acceleration. So in the theory today, that's usually never addressed and left right out, because it's just kind of addressed that there's one at all, and then a second and a third, maybe a fourth and a fifth and a sixth, and each of the higher order ones. I mean, it's acknowledged that each of these exists, just not so much that they all do. So figuring out how to make it so that the infinitely many higher orders of acceleration enter the definition of mechanics has been kind of the idea here. And it started as with regards to waves, and really that in these readings, there was the readings about the differential dynamics, and which helped to explore a lot going on with the dichotomy of the differential equations and the integral equations, and how important it is to have both of those. They make a gestalt together and integrate into each other in the different integral and the integral differ. And then as with regards to the extraordinary of those, the ordinary of those, the integer-wise action of the operation of terms and the differential operators and integral operators, and the non-integer parts, the extraordinary, those as part of algebraic geometry and nonlinear analysis and these kinds of things, then came into this topic of moment and motion to help describe what is moment and what is motion. And here it's established and framed that geometry is motion, perspective and projection make for this important moving part that's pretty much always just considered as a static picture, but it's always implicitly present, just like these other what are becoming these zeroth laws of motion: rest, motion, equal, opposite, out into force as a function of time, and then gravity is something a little bit left over and for sort of a later account, but brought into the thing, the re-origination of events. That then the theory of the wave mechanics came into it quite a bit, and the ideas of the how to consider the quantum mechanics, and as well what goes into the dynamics of light and massive bodies and charge and electrical and magnetic fields. Those considered pretty much as waves with a concession to the particle and particulate nature of these interactions, all the theory and these ideas, to where it arrived at. It's kind of well established that then there's a particular mathematical framework that can be attached to help fulfill these. Well, instead of becoming much higher later and afterthoughts of the theory, have to kind of be emplaced and kind of retrofit into the foundations of the definitions why it is so, and that reasonably and according to reason that it is so, and why it is so. So to make sure that for thinking people, they can write for themselves a brief proof mathematically to the effect that this kind of thing is so, and that it must be in this sense. Thusly, the idea is to help bring that forward as kind of just, from my perspective, is just part of the theory, the theory, and as with regards to finding where in the study already that these pieces are, they come together to form this thing, like the collocation or the collocation of thing when trying to figure out from many dimensions one, and from one dimension a unit, and these kinds of things, how they kind of come together with regards to the definitions of the theory of the mechanics. That's been kind of carried out, and so it's kind of been reaching from the study of waves and kind of a thorough account of motion and change, and the philosophy behind the reasoning behind the theory of the abstract, because all this stuff kind of comes along with this common dialectic called the canon and canonical dogma and the doctrine of all the theory. Then there's all this richness of detail in terms of the numerical methods and the applied and all this kind of thing for mechanics of motion and defining moment and motion, that it's about been defined what is motion and change in motion. And then as with regards to moment and changes in moment is this description of the kinetic and the kinematic as a linear and then rotational, each different, so that in our premier theories of the day, we can re-equip the models with space frames and frame spaces, which is part of a discussion on the theory of relativity, to get into where then moment and motion start to define that this whole geometry is motion bit, and the space of things and the geometry of things is enriched, so that then for our theory of axiomless natural deduction, that we can arrive at this theory of axiomless geometry, and that we have a notion of continuity and continuous propagation of a course of passage from 0 to 1 of a contiguous sequence of points, and that they're continuous, that this is the bridge between continuous and discrete, that first in pre-calculus class we're told does not exist gently, so that then the entire course of the standard and the linear curriculum can so proceed with delta epsilonics without any otherwise mention of infinity at all, up to a point to where some definitions are provided. It's like, and it's given the least upper bound property, and it's given measure 1.0. And we just kind of build this in again with this infinitary reasoning, just like from what was stated, is like it is a deductive result that this is required, and that the theory as it is, well as well, it's a picture of the things, is not complete without otherwise equipping it with some higher level apparatus. That in looking for that, then most of the inspiration or reasoning about it I found from the canon and learning to understand what there already is and was, how we arrived at what's called the severe abstraction. That meaning that this is our theory, and it's really pared down to the minimal yet most meaningful elementary account of this mechanical reduction, which is explaining that everything is in the theory, like heat and even light and these other things, are matters of motion and mechanics of quantities and their interactions, events, usually in the statistical mechanics, after mechanics, that the theory is statistical mechanics of motion and rest or moment and motion. And then having at least some non-standard, super standard notions of continuity and the laws of large numbers helps, because they show up later when trying to explain this. That then that's reached kind of a place where in the course of moment and motion, that moment and motion is kind of reaching to a stopping point. And so then with regards to that, then the stop derivative and the identity dimension, which arose from descriptive differential dynamics and the idea fix from this series. And then what came of that as after the complex diagram, the notions of the original analysis and the integral analysis with the identity dimension is with regards to a thorough course of that as a diagram for the setup of the representation of forms of these things. Then came into this notion of the moment in motion with after that there was also brought with that the stop derivative, then this stop derivative and walk integral and pause integral and run derivative as helping to explain that in this study of mechanics there are many different aspects of opinions or alternatives in the ideals, and what's absolute and what's relative, the ideals that are left simply constant or free and fixed. That the wider theory has naturally those as interplay each other. Then as with regards to framing at least one infinitely many higher orders of acceleration, it's kind of framed as this hypercube distance for another argument after Zeno's swath and this hypercube distance bit, that at least there's a descriptive account that makes a deconstructive account of the mechanics to bring that in for like lines and units and spiral space filling curves and rotations, to have a pretty thorough, yet only minimally more so, is still severely abstract and mechanically reduced, the theory, yet still has enough working terms to not end up just being partial, or to not be fully rational. If you might say that to be fully rational, it has to be able to make a 90-degree turn that's also a pi halves radians turn. So it's a transcendental number in terms of being able to say that nothing can eventually end up being discrete in terms of like a highest order of acceleration, and out of nothing arising this thing, the movement from an infinite potential, an infinite impetus to get it moving at all. This for me is that's kind of where it's arrived at. That then they become these ideas, and that then just from talking them out in this manner, then later I just intend to kind of just collect those in a very, very sort of brief description, and then have that be, say, a simple assembly of interchangeable elements, proof elements, for many sorts of kind of considerations. So that's kind of where it's at, and what I figured to relate today. That now it's back to the stacks. So it's a survey, and it's back to the stacks. And the stacks is this stack of books at the library. So today's then is a bit of recap of philosophy. And so what I got here, and I've been reading this this book by a fellow, I think his name is Raj. And what his book's called is Structural Depths of Indian Philosophy. And so the index are the philosophy of the Vedas and the after Mohenjo-daro and the Jains, and then also the Buddhists and the Hindus arrive as after the Aryans, and the Vedics as it was a very, very long time ago. And there's some dispute about whether it was more than 1100 or 1500 BC, or how ancient it was. There's a reading of Campbell's book about the 10,000 Faces. And Campbell's book was very integrative. And what it helped a lot was to establish that about the time of about 0 AD, there was fundamentally a world culture, that there was between the Near East, as it were, and the Far East, and that just being kind of like from the Dardanelles in Turkey and Cairo and Egypt to Nepal and point south, the Near East and Far East, and that being kind of the East, these days as we call it. Then that the West was was Rome, and the Mediterranean basin, and then later, thousands of years later, the continental tradition or Europe. And then today, then when the great migration went from Europe to the Americas, and it's the stories of that with regards to the world and the cultures of the world. Then this story about the prehistory of philosophy and religion, and of this Campbell's story about the ancients like the Zoroastrians and the Mithraics and otherwise these establishments of cultures of philosophy was very enlightening in the sense that I felt it put things together. And one thing that it had in it was it had a timelines that kind of helped establish that it wasn't so much farther back than 2,000 or 4,000 years BC that this was like the earliest recorded history that we still have, vis-a-vis the cave paintings of Lascaux, or stuff discovered under the ocean or in the desert, or of what seemed to be even older prehistorical civilizations, as with regards to things like Mohenjo-Daro or something like that, the Indus, or Ceylon, this island of Ceylon, and these kinds of things. That with regards to, though, then in the history that survives of this philosophy is like the eras that spread over tens of thousands of years and these kinds of things, over longer periods of time that are not seemingly to scale, when they pretty much line up instead with these common traditions, when like everything that comes in the Abrahamic religions is basically out of the Zoroastrian religions, or something like besides the Jains, and then being invaded by these relatively uncivilized cultures, kind of like the Attila and the Huns, or the Aryans, or the Plans and the Uyghur, or Temujin Khan, or the Arabs, and or the Goths, or the otherwise these times when uncivilized societies, though they were totally asymmetrical in terms of cultural and technological development, still turned over to kind of like the system of authority and power, in a sense, of what then became of the history together, is that these dates line up pretty well in terms of then with regards to the Indian philosophy is one of the oldest overall philosophies together. Now, there's also something kind of in contrast or just different, like the Egyptians and the mystic tradition of the Egyptians. But the idea is that the structural philosophy is kind of like a higher aspect of thinking. Is before that, the traditions were basically fertility cults, and really the nature and then animatism and animism. And then afterwards became things of matters of reason, like the fundamental question of metaphysics. Why is there something rather than nothing? And that this then became all such matters of these questions in the dialectic and the reasoning about things like numbers and infinity, or words and the names of things. So as I was reading this book, then it also speaks a lot, because what I can read of it and understand of it is its relation to Western tradition, as its title intends to convey, structural depths, meaning that as a technical philosophy, it's structurally related to other models, structures of technical interest, of inference about the The one are these Platonic ideals, because then there's a universe of Platonic ideals, mathematical and logical, and anything else like Plato's Republic and Socrates and all this kind of stuff is kind of left on the side. But that's just representation that Plato describes a universe that's complete and true, and Comenius says there's a language in which its words are also true and complete. That then there's a well and ready relation of otherwise these terms, both for the side of the various dualisms of these philosophies and the monisms, and then for the study of the relation of the philosophies as theologies or theories of being and existence with regards to something that's higher order than humanity, at least, and higher order than anything we could invent or create at all. It has then what I've been kind of studying is these books with the relation from this most ancient philosophy, how it relates to our Western philosophy, and then some books on Western philosophy, and then a book on kind of the 21st century's take on the transhuman ideas of what happens when there's technological singularities, as with regards to the theories of thinkers like Raymond Kurzweil, and the idea that the singularity is the idea that something like Moore's law, which is that the power of computational information processing doubles every few years, and thus in a short order of time we'll have achieved the great chessboard full of rice, doubling each square a mountain bigger than the world. So that's the kind of the idea then here is with regards to that this is all connected by one silver thread, or a shastra is a term, of teleology and this metaphysics from the cyclic metaphysic bit, that about halfway in these moment in motion talks there was quite a strong and thorough establishment that there is metaphysics and not just ontology. That it was one quote from that structural depths of Raju that really spoke to me, because that's what also it says. So I agreed with it, because then also it seems very thorough in its treatment of it, and its terms are authoritative, correct, as it were. So let's take a look at this and see what we can find from it. This here is then these two books about that. So, Structural Depths of Indian Thought by P.T. Raju, and this is from Wiley Blackwell. It's called Science Fiction and Philosophy from Time Travel to Superintelligence, edited by Susan Schneider. And it has pieces from Nick Bostrom and George Annas. I really enjoyed George Annas, who helps explain questions of ethics in the transhuman time, the laws of robotics, Asimov. It starts with Descartes and Plato, which makes sense as they are abstractly plain representations that any thinking being could arrive at, that mathematics is a universal language. And then the structural depth of Indian thought has that this author, he wrote over the course of his career 50 years of writing, that this was later in his career and one of his summary works, and that it's really quite remarkable to have that because it's largely in English, and then along with this other who seems to be the most cited or accessible author was of a sort after P.T. Raju. Then there's Bhagavad Das, Mr. Das, that of these hundreds and hundreds of references as regards to like Sri Harsa's Kandanakarya, and the ideas that go into the neo-nanya or logic and these kinds of things, that the notions of the for me, mathematics and the ancient Ananta and the spiral is also helps reflect it. Though this is like one of the most thoroughly promulgated and most properly kept traditions that survived these 5,000 years at least. That then also the ancient Egyptians had their own track where it's the same symbology as with regards to Thoth and the notions of mathematics being a universal language and even being a theory that somehow made it over the prehistorical times. And the diluvian, antediluvian end is found throughout the world in ancient sigils and carvings since antiquity. So this is a great book. And then he talks about the development historically and then the structural form that's usually accepted and realized today as with regards to the categories of the world and the mimamsa, and that being an ontology, and also as with regards to this. And then he talks about something as with regards to like the arthakara, what's the value of worth of something, and that I'm still only barely learning the word roots or the etymology of the Sanskrit. Compare the Greek roots and the Latin roots, of course, are highly acculturated here. And then as with regards to like the Far Eastern roots, well, a lot of them are Sanskrit. And then also as with regards to that, there are various, and these kinds of things are so. And he talks about things like the Mimamsakas, and if excuse me, my pronunciation is not correct, and the validity of knowledge. And then I didn't really particularly mark this passage. I've read up about this far, about the cognition and perception, and abstraction, but he does particularly use the words teleology and ontology, or the metaphysics, and relates that a particular expressed consideration was that there is an implicit and detachable metaphysics, pretty much. With regards to the sutras or aphorisms, and thusly that they have their discussion of the meaning, the epistemology of the Upanishads, which are the great stories after the Vedas of the Vedics. In the time, basically, the times of the inception of the Index, when the Index of the Aryans and the Dravidians and the Mohenjo-daro peoples all came together. And as with regards to then that this goes into a great consideration that, as the author put it, he wanted to write a history of the philosophy of the Indians. And I'm not sure who exactly is on the cover, but it's a pair of individuals, people that appear to be making a dance of some form. That then he considered that this was an effort to write a history of the philosophy, and that as well kind of what this science fiction and philosophy is like. That's what science fiction authors are trying to guess and wonder, what will the philosophy be like in the future, and not just the way it already is today, but specifically in the future, and these kinds of things. That these kind of then speak together of univocity and haeccity, what the meaning of being in things, and that univocity is this idea from Duns Scotus, but of the time and the place, and then kind of enshrined with him, and with the infinity and univocity, that is Platonistic monism available to a humble parishioner, of a sense, of the time of 1100 AD, kind of halfway between now and when the books of what later fully became largely involved most of Hinduism and Buddhism, thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, or about a third of the way, I suppose, rather, if you excuse me. So quite a few, as Raju puts it, he says, quite a few philosophers in India are well up in both Western and Indian thought, and there's an intensive search for comparison and evaluation, and a few attempts at a synthesis of both, a search that has now become worldwide but still in a groping stage. The word synthesis should not be understood as leading to one philosophy and a philosophical regimentation or totalitarianism. Every philosophical tradition will have its own synthesis and methods of synthesis, and every philosopher may chuck out his own method. But he should know what he has to synthesize. The first requisite is therefore clear mutual understanding. Now, I'll leave off that that's a false wall, that understanding isn't really comprehension. And so that when we have our metaphor eventually fails. But our metonymy is the idea that there's a strong metonymy, and that is eventually comprehensive. And so with regards to then, the author here expressing that there's an ontology where it's equity interpretable good theories, while each is their own thing. That's fine. Yet at the same time that there is kind of like a common thread is also another thing. He gently encourages the reader to take or leave as he sees fit, while at the same time making sure that it affects reflect that he may or may not know what the philosophy of another may be, because everybody has their own philosophy. Everybody has their own psychology. There are profound commonalities in philosophy and psychology among all peoples, and then are considered to be very, very particularly sound philosophies with regards to the technical philosophy and philosophies of reasoning, philosophies of science, mathematics, and so on. And then as with regards to psychology, it's not much different. There are many, many treatments of psychology as with regards to behavior or expectations of behavior, and also as with regards to morals and ethics usually. And then largely the schools and the consideration of morals and ethics is it is as well as an individual thing, besides that at the same time can be said to be a universal thing, yet it's not my place to tell people what it should be. And I could be wrong, and so I wouldn't want to say something about somebody's moral and ethical philosophy, which is so much more kind of the character of their individuality, whereas I feel totally free making statements about reason and mechanics and science and mathematics, because I feel there's just like a totally undeniable truth in that no matter what, it doesn't matter what I say. So that's kind of where I don't really necessarily, though I have one, care to share philosophy of ethics and morals, and because it develops, and I'm not quite sure if it's what I want to hear, but at the same time, then with regards to the technical philosophy, that is what we take from this philosophy, because it always had to be that the religion and the philosophy also had to satisfy the technical philosophy, and it does, and it did, as we talked about, like from the medieval philosophers, where all these things were basically placed for sure into what we bind ourselves to, the ontological commitment of these. So philosophical activity in contemporary India is varied. You might consider that in India there are basically two schools or parties. So and again, this is if I'm mistaken, I'd hope to apologize. But there's the parties who kind of draw their fingers up vertically, and those who draw their fingers horizontally. So it's kind of like one of these, horizontally or vertically things, and that they kind of represent two kind of schools, and one of kind of materialism and another kind of like asceticism or what. And so it's funny though to help relate that, as well as with regards to that. Again, that's not technical, so. We'll lay off on that a bit. But otherwise, then this is really a great author, and he writes very, very thorough and long paragraphs. He says, material substance cannot know that it remains the same. It cannot know through the changes of its qualities, but the witness consciousness can do so. So that's kind of the reflection here of what the object sense is in objectivity. Is this witness consciousness. And he talks about being and becoming, and these, of course, are the usual terms from Kant, and so he frames all this stuff to do with the prana and the exercises of to Kant. For example, in a footnote, he says, it may sound contradictory to speak of the attribute of rajas as both active and passive, but compare the principle of prana being divided into 5 classes, one of which is again prana. The so-called passive state is its latent state. So that speaks well to things like a dialectic on the dialectic and these kinds of things. Curiously enough, the Sanskrit word for object is visaya, which etymologically means that which ties down our consciousness to itself. When I'm actually in the process of perceiving the object, I'm not conscious for myself or of the distinction between the universal and the individual. When I have such consciousness, I must have freed myself from the actual object, risen to the level of thought, and appropriated the whole experience as mine. So this is from the section, the yoga and self-realization through psychophysical practice. Sources of valid cognition. That otherwise this book of Rajat and in his school and his many works really reflect about the most accessible and the most thorough and the most topical description of the Indic philosophies and their origins, their developments, and their relations to our contemporary and premier philosophies of today of the West with regards to the Greeks and the continentals of the world. And in his discussion on ethical morals, he introduces values and ways. Now, I'm still kind of looking for this quote that he helped to reflect that there was the teleology and the ontology together, and using those words. And I will maybe look to find that some other time. But it's here. It's somewhere in this book. How can it be true? Metaphysics. Perhaps it is here in this section of metaphysics. Well, there's not yet mention here of teleology or ontology. Those being pretty much the words I'm scanning for it. Oh, wait. Well, he does mention a teleological argument is with regards to the higher power bit. There's the higher power is super scientific. It's established. And he has some great stuff about prior negation and being and non-being. And the Prabhakara. And he talks about the categories, life's ideals, the Bhagavad Gita, and then later he gets into to summaries of the Vedas, and those are pretty technical. And they that's the whole Brahman and Atman stuff, and they help to explain matters of perspective and projective with regards to the objective and subjective in so few words. They also are in a sense less technical. So there's then a usual course where even such and similarly such expositions as this are not necessarily considered to be sufficiently the severely abstracted and the mechanically reduced to be purely technical. Yet as well, there's always the interpretability of what is the technical in it, as that it goes without saying that is incontrovertible itself. So I'm enjoying this book, and what I hope to gain from it is that among the stacks and among the survey, that will help to further establish the very rich and carefully cultivated development of these thinkers. And then as with regards to how things are and go, that in this next section in metaphysics that we have for this next school about a mechanistic view of the universe and their opposition to teleology in the inner universe. So he has, for example, that the Caravaccas are kind of like the Epicureans, and the Platonists were like, there is a thing, and the Epicureans were like, I can't see it. And so then there's, with regards to that, then they each have their own ideas of whether teleology and the function, the first principles and final cause are real, or as with regards to whether they're only eventual or potential, and is whether that they're yet real. And then as with regards to these kinds of things. And one of these sections of metaphysics, for one of these discussions of the structural things, then got into the heno-theory, which is like, it's the same theory again and again and again in so many different ways that then that it arrives at all these different ways. So I'll perhaps find that somewhere later as I'm still reading this. But in these sections upon the metaphysics, it relates largely to the same categories and concepts of the technical philosophy of the world culture and our premier philosophy. He talks about in page 98 the other logo, Husserl's philosophy, and Hume, who has no miracles, yet it is a miracle. Descartes, cosmic consciousness, the antaryamin, inner controller. Now, this is an important concept of the ontological commitment and take it or leave it, is that the inner controller is always willing to pick up or put down anything. So what you want for it to have readily available is something that is reliable. The reader of the Upanishadic literature. It talks about the detached witness, and that's the sense of inner objectivity. That the idea of objectivism as a philosophy is that sometime in your late teens, early 20s, after like in your teenage years, when you establish this like I'm not alone in the world, and then you establish something like as well, it's like I am alone in the world, and then it's like the world is an imagination. And then it's like that's called objectivism, and then the philosophical maturity kind of tends to continue to so follow, where it kind of comes around again, and it's like, well, maybe I'm the figment, and so some people get trapped in one of these corners instead of this heno-theory, and it kind of coming around and around, or they encounter these different steps in mental maturity and philosophical maturity at various stages and according to various conditions, or they don't. And so these various ideas of the raptures of them, or the satori, or these other ideas of the great kind of formative and or sometimes breakthroughs of the philosophy in terms of higher reasoning and higher truths are a pretty heavy deal, and they should be, because they're significant and they're formative. So he discusses these usual concepts with regards to perception and the apparatus of perception. So then there's associated with this also a practice of traditional medicine, exercises and forms and kata and all these kinds of things that can really go a long way towards it was a pretty holistic worldview. Same time, it's associated with lots of like stuff that's associated kind of more with like the cultural accoutrement of the mass society or the mob or the arcology and the kind of this kind of thing, which are not considered reasonable at all, which are not. So that's kind of so. Now, that's kind of what it was. I hope to intend to convey about the again, that the West and East are the same, and that here kind of the West is the best, and so that the West and East are the best together, and then then for philosophy, that there's a technical philosophy, so we can have from philosophy this metaphysical assertion that there is a true and consistent and complete theory, so we can combine that with foundations of logic and mathematics, that there is a true and consistent and complete theory. Because if you haven't heard of it, a lot of issues and foundations arrive today have that there's this impasse where when they get to ontology and try and have a giant graphical structure of all knowledge, information, and structure that there could be in the world and of this universe, of this theory, that there's no universe at all, because it would contain itself. It would have to be these sublime things that, as is discussed here, that Kant helps keep alive and Hegel helps keep alive, while at the same time slamming the door shut on, many other aspects of mysticism and animism. That it really works out that thusly then this Comenius language is able to carry and make for logic a logic with no paradoxes, at least once, so that then there can be this thing. So that ever since then, logicist positivism has been like, we have an ontology and no teleology we can rely on. We have no teleology that we can rely on. So that led to existentialism filling these holes, and nihilism filling these holes, otherwise that were brought by the metaphysics. That here again today we're free to re-equip the structure with this briefest of metaphysics. It's just called the silver thread, or an answer to the fundamental question of metaphysics that's pretty much explained quite directly, and as a matter for axiomless natural deduction, and then even furthermore axiomless geometry, so that form and proportion arise. And then the rest is considered kind of subordinate to that the archetectonic of the overall structure, because we're structuralists, and so there's a structure to these things, is this extraordinary theory. As far as I can tell from my ontological commitment to this foundations, that's all I need to start and stop, is like, it's just a theory that is perfect. Everything else just kind of must agree, or I'm not looking at the correct aspect of it. Because if it's correct and true, it's correct and true. So at least that's always a given. And that's because it's possible that super scientific makes it a gift. Otherwise it's not. And then there must be coped with an existentialism and a nihilism, and the development of practical and working, or the abandonment of practical or working effective psychology or philosophy for practical purposes or aesthetic purposes. Here, though, there is at least one, so that's good. All right, then, so we kind of looked at then to bookmark that as like the most ancient and prehistoric cultural tradition of structural philosophy still around, and the latest one where it's like, we don't know what's going to happen when it goes out the window. Super intelligence. Super intelligence. I feel like I was lucky to have lived in a time when, on the one hand, it was like when special effects could represent graphically anything that you can imagine. At the same time, it was still a culture where most things could not ever be rendered in that manner. So everything had to be built via an imagination, purely textual imagination first. There was no possible means to acquire this graphical imagination except as via means of textual imagination. And so, in a sense, I feel like everybody should have that experience if they're really going to kind of look out, because otherwise they're kind of lost in one or the other. And so, if that's so, then it kind of needs to be bridged. which is possible. One of the aspects of the ancient philosophies is at some point in time there's the hermitage, which means to take a course of getting away from all other people for an extended period of time on one's own account to but it has to be somehow be made possible to, like, not that to be a torture, but to be somehow like a sort of time for oneself to reach a level of philosophical maturity to then be able to pick up these sorts of concepts. That's a very usual concept in many philosophies. So then these other two books that I thought to take a look at were these are rather large volumes, I suppose. But just because a book is large really often means it just has large print. But this is A New History of Western Philosophy by Anthony Kenny, and this is Bertrand Russell's Folio Society's History of Western Philosophy. So we got Bertrand Russell here, and so Bertrand Russell I kind of have as an opportunistic flake. And is that good or bad? Well, at least he seems a conscientious and reasonably urbane and a nice enough hypocritical flake. And then as with regards to, though, the treatment of Frege, but later of just the theory, and saying it's like, I've made Russell's paradox and I use it on you, so your continental German rigorization of this will no longer proceed. And then here, let me give to you back this same thing put in the form of an axiom, and I say it was so. And also all the stuff that came out of material implication, this kind of stuff. So I kind of have that's some shade, basically, that I'd care to put on this guy. But he has this great kind of breakdown, and a lot of the stuff has been considered here with regards to like the Eleatics, or he calls them the pre-Socratics. Heraclitus and Parmenides and Zeno are big three here. And then Plato and Aristotle. And Socrates is left out because he was just kind of, he's an organizer, but Plato and Aristotle are the big in that. And then we get to Democritus and those kind of make for those being the world. Then he talks about the Epicureans that were mentioned here, and then the Neo-Platonists, and the fact that there was not much more else development for hundreds and hundreds of years. So there is up to Augustine of 500 AD or so. There was great amount of development in the Rome and in the in the scientific and the technical, and as with regards to the development of world culture, but not so much in the philosophical developments. Let me get up into after the rabbinical started like 200 AD and the kind of like a new school of Judaism. Then there was the doctors of the church 800 years later. So, or like that Augustine came up first, and then they kind of introduced the ideas of the doctors. There had been like 30 doctors of the Catholic Church over the millennia. And then there's the scholastics. And then he gives that. So we've been just reading this medieval philosophy, and he gets up to that here with John Erigena. So we discussed him a little bit. And then about the Mohammedan. So that's probably where we'll look to see what's going on in the Mohammedan culture and philosophy. And then hundreds of years later, he doesn't say anything so much about Aquinas or Duns Scotus. He mentions Aquinas and the Franciscan schoolmen. So that's who I'll be interested to see here about, is the Franciscan schoolmen and the Mohammedan culture and philosophy. Then the Renaissance, and then we get into a bunch of these different ideas like Hobbes and Leviathan, and where's Hume, but he's got Spinoza and Leibniz. But then this other book also we got Suarez, and so Suarez is pretty good, and because otherwise then the rest of this is not so much so great. See, the problem I have with this guy is he's got a big focus on Francis Bacon, but I'm only really a fan of Roger Bacon, not Francis Bacon. So, 446. Franciscan schoolmen. Franciscans were less impeccably orthodox than Dominicans. So like Aquinas was the Dominican, fine. And then there's basically the Benedictines and the Franciscans. And the Benedictines are rich and the Franciscans are poor. So it's kind of like, the different kinds or whatever. So he talks about Bonaventure. Now, Roger Bacon, so here he does talk about Roger Bacon. Roger Bacon was not greatly admired in his own day, but in modern times has been praised far beyond his deserts. So now he's throwing the shade on Roger Bacon. He's like he wasn't that. He was not so much a philosopher in the narrow sense as a man of universal learning with a passion for mathematics and science. Well, yeah, he's held up as he defined science. Science in his day was mixed up with alchemy. Thought it'd be mixed up with black magic. Bacon was constantly getting into trouble through being suspected of heresy and magic. Well, that's interesting, I suppose. Yet we lionize these guys, and keep the good parts. In 1271, he wrote a book called Compendium Studii Philosophiae. This did nothing. In 1270, his books were condemned, and he was put in prison for 14 years. Ew. I didn't really recall that. So, Bertrand Russell puts Roger Bacon under this subsection of Franciscan scholars, but I'm seeing what he says about anything about Duns Scotus at all. Mentions Seneca, Cicero, Averroes, Adelard of Bath, St. Chrysostom. These authorities, he thinks, suffice to prove that one should not respect authority. Then he just kind of reads off what they say. He quotes various, among them Grosseteste. Bacon follows Averroes in holding that the active intellect is a substance separated from the soul and essence. Well, I don't know about that. Plato praising Bacon, Roger, not Francis. Certainly his interests. And he mentions some other thinkers. Oh, Duns Scotus. I just want to see what he says about Scotus. He was born, became a Franciscan, spent his years against Aquinas. He is Augustinian, but less extreme. He discusses, for example, the question whether any sure and pure truth can be known naturally by the understanding of the wayfarer without the special illumination of the uncreated light. And he argues that it cannot. I just think that you can make it yourself, so he supports this view. Duns Scotus was a moderate realist, he says. It's like Duns Scotus was a super ordinary Platonist. Says most Franciscans follow Duns Scotus rather than Aquinas, and I don't think that's so, because Franciscans follow both, abstractly as reasoning peoples vis-a-vis, they're some of the questions of propriety or what. So he doesn't yet mention univocity or haeccity, the thinghood, although he does mention the thinghood, so that's the haeccity. Identity of indiscernibles, and so the individuals, the individual, and the discernibles, and then he gets into William of Ockham. And then he says that Ockham was the pupil, and afterwards against Scotus. So, yeah. Scotus is my favorite then of those. And then I wanted to see briefly of Averroes or Ibn Averroes. We kind of run up to time. So what I figured to do would be to look at some philosophies from more later, because it's this being about 51 or 52 episodes of these volumes of the essays in the Moment in Motion, there'll be another one. And at which time then we'll reach to a close and kind of getting through a little bit more of the entire philosophy of the history of philosophy as related technically to the description of moment in motion, and then relating that to our science of our history of physics, and then that thusly we'll be able to kind of conclude and then later to look back at these ideas that are developed about the infinite many higher orders of acceleration and the various mathematical models that go with that, and to then be able to just kind of reference those as of a course of otherwise a pretty thorough survey of the surrounds that is yet shallow, meaning from the shallow end that individuals who want to learn and explore some of these kind of concepts can understand these things in the plain language that it employs. It is very thorough, because then it's presented all these things that must be conclusive, what must be, es muss sein, as with regards to then why it is so, and that it is so. And for all the rest of the question words, how it is so. Moment is motion. Geometry is motion.